The grand ballroom of the Sterling Hotel was a masterpiece of modern luxury, high vaulted ceilings, golden chandeliers reflecting off marble floors, and a sea of perfectly dressed executives sipping champagne and trading calculated smiles. It was the annual corporate gala for Titan Strategies, the kind of event where careers were made or broken, where board members whispered about promotions over glasses of aged scotch. For Brittany Clark, this was supposed to be the night she proved her worth, not as someone's wife, not as a token figure, but as a force in the corporate world. She had spent months preparing for this presentation. It wasn't just another routine business proposal, it was a game changer. She had studied market trends, identified gaps in the industry, and developed a strategy that could redefine Titan Strategies' future. Late nights at her desk, countless revisions, meticulous research, every slide of her PowerPoint carried not just numbers, but her ambition, her drive, her belief in what she had built. And it had all led to this moment. Brittany stood at the sleek podium, gripping the edges as she looked out at the audience of executives, investors, and board members. Her heart pounded, but she reminded herself that she had earned this. She belonged here. She adjusted the microphone, cleared her throat, and smiled. Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm honored to present a strategic growth initiative that... Laughter. Not from the audience. Not yet. But from him. Lucas Banks, standing near the center of the room, swirling a glass of champagne in his hand, his dark navy suit immaculate, his confidence unshaken. Her husband. Brittany's stomach twisted. My wife has always had a wonderful imagination, Lucas announced, his voice carrying through the ballroom as if he had every right to interrupt her. A real gift for storytelling. Maybe she should have gone into event planning instead of business strategy. The laughter started small, a chuckle here, a smirk there, but it spread like wildfire. Lucas, she said sharply, her hands tightening around the podium. Oh, come on, Britt, he continued, flashing her that smug smile that once charmed her but now felt like a knife to the ribs. We all know this is adorable, but let's be realistic. Titan Strategies doesn't need fairy tales. A few executives laughed louder this time. A couple of women at the front exchanged amused glances, whispering behind their manicured hands. Brittany felt her skin burn, not from embarrassment, but from something far more dangerous. Rage. She could have handled skepticism. She could have handled tough questions or pushback on her proposal. But this? Being belittled and dismissed in front of the entire company by her own husband? Her grip on the podium tightened, her nails pressing into the smooth wood. She glanced at the CEO, Gregory Walters, who looked mildly entertained, and then at the board members, most of whom were observing with a mix of curiosity and indulgence, as if this were a performance rather than a professional pitch. And perhaps to them it was. Lucas had always been the golden boy at Titan Strategies. The charming, confident, untouchable executive. The man who networked like it was a blood sport and climbed the corporate ladder with effortless ease. And for years, Brittany had been the supportive wife standing in his shadow, playing her role perfectly. But that ended tonight. She forced a smile and adjusted her posture. If they thought she would shrink under the weight of their laughter, they had underestimated her. She turned to the audience, meeting their eyes head-on. You know, Lucas, she said, her voice steady, controlled, that's a fascinating perspective coming from someone whose last 3 projects have underperformed by nearly 12% each quarter. The laughter cut off sharply. Lucas's expression flickered for a split second, but he quickly masked it with a forced chuckle. Oh, Brittany, sweetheart, that's... And yet, she continued, clicking a button on her remote to pull up a slide of company performance metrics, here we are, watching an entire division struggle with inefficiencies that this proposal directly addresses. A murmur spread through the audience. People sat up straighter. Brittany's confidence grew. I appreciate constructive criticism, she said smoothly, pacing slightly as she spoke, but if you're going to dismiss my work, Lucas, let's at least base it on data, not whatever punchline you were attempting. A few people chuckled, not at her, but with her. She saw the moment Lucas realized he had miscalculated. The charm he wielded so well had backfired. Still, he smirked, adjusting his tie. "Well, you always were persistent," he mused, feigning amusement as he took another sip of champagne. "Let's see if that translates to something useful." Brittany knew that was his way of trying to regain control. To make her sound like an eager, overreaching wife instead of a professional in her own right. But the damage was already done to him, because the people in the room were now listening to her. She continued her presentation, moving through the slides with precision, countering potential objections before they could even be voiced. She spoke with clarity, authority, and just enough sharpness in her tone to make it clear she would not be dismissed again. By the time she finished, the murmurs had turned into intrigued conversations. The board members were flipping through the printed packets, nodding at the numbers. Brittany set down the remote with finality. "Thank you," she said, and then, because she refused to let Lucas have the last word, she turned to the CEO. "I'm happy to take any questions about the proposal." A deliberate jab. Gregory Walters smiled slightly, folding his hands. "I think you've given us quite a bit to consider." And just like that, Brittany had reclaimed the room. Lucas still had that smirk plastered on his face, but she could see it now for what it was, a mask, a thin veneer of arrogance covering the fact that, for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. As the evening progressed, executives approached Brittany, not Lucas, to discuss her ideas. She shook hands, exchanged business cards, and secured follow-up meetings. Lucas, meanwhile, nursed his drink in the corner, watching. And as Brittany left the ballroom that night, stepping into the crisp night air, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of her career. It was the beginning of something much, much bigger. Brittany stayed at Titan Strategies for another 6 months after that night. Not because she wanted to. She had known the second Lucas humiliated her in front of the entire company that she wouldn't be staying forever. But she needed time. Time to observe. Time to prepare. Time to ensure that when she walked away, she wasn't just leaving the company, she was setting the stage for something far greater. Lucas, of course, acted as if nothing had happened. After the gala, he didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge the way he had publicly tried to humiliate her. Instead, he carried on with the same arrogant confidence, the same easy charm, the same belief that he was untouchable. But Brittany noticed the shift. The CEO, Gregory Walters, had started inviting her to more meetings. Senior executives who had once overlooked her were now interested in her ideas. She was making inroads, small ones, but enough to make Lucas uneasy. He began undermining her in subtle ways. "Brittany has a lot of passion," he'd say in meetings, a condescending smile on his face. "But we need to be realistic about execution." Or, "She's got some interesting ideas, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves." He was careful, always careful. He never outright dismissed her the way he had at the gala. He knew better now. But he planted doubts, used his influence with senior leadership to steer conversations away from her, kept her from getting the authority she needed to move her projects forward. And for 6 months, Brittany let him think he was winning. She nodded along when executives hesitated on implementing her ideas. She took on smaller projects, allowing Lucas to believe she had been put back in her place. She let him think she was just another ambitious woman who had overreached, been swatted down, and learned her lesson. All while she planned her escape. Brittany didn't just quit. She studied everything, how the company operated, where its weaknesses were, which investors were unhappy, which departments were struggling under Lucas's leadership. She built contacts outside of Titan Strategies, meeting with industry leaders and forming relationships with investors. Then, when the moment was right, she walked into Gregory Walters' office and handed in her resignation. "You sure about this?" the CEO asked, studying her. She nodded. "I have something else in mind." He didn't press. And just like that, she walked away. No severance package. No fanfare. Just a simple resignation letter and a quiet exit from the company she had once dreamed of helping build. Lucas didn't even try to stop her. He smirked when she told him, acting as if it was nothing more than a temporary setback. "You'll land on your feet," he said, in that patronizing tone that made her want to throw her coffee in his face. "I'm sure you'll find something that suits you." She smiled. "I already have." Brittany stayed at Titan Strategies for another 6 months after that night. Not because she wanted to. She had known the second Lucas humiliated her in front of the entire company that she wouldn't be staying forever. But she needed time. Time to observe. Time to prepare. Time to ensure that when she walked away, she wasn't just leaving the company, she was setting the stage for something far greater. Lucas, of course, acted as if nothing had happened. After the gala, he didn't apologize. Didn't acknowledge the way he had publicly tried to humiliate her. Instead, he carried on with the same arrogant confidence, the same easy charm, the same belief that he was untouchable. But Brittany noticed the shift. The CEO, Gregory Walters, had started inviting her to more meetings. Senior executives who had once overlooked her were now interested in her ideas. She was making inroads, small ones, but enough to make Lucas uneasy. He began undermining her in subtle ways. "Brittany has a lot of passion," he'd say in meetings, a condescending smile on his face. "But we need to be realistic about execution." Or, "She's got some interesting ideas, but let's not get too ahead of ourselves." He was careful, always careful. He never outright dismissed her the way he had at the gala. He knew better now. But he planted doubts, used his influence with senior leadership to steer conversations away from her, kept her from getting the authority she needed to move her projects forward. And for 6 months, Brittany let him think he was winning. She nodded along when executives hesitated on implementing her ideas. She took on smaller projects, allowing Lucas to believe she had been put back in her place. She let him think she was just another ambitious woman who had overreached, been swatted down, and learned her lesson. All while she planned her escape. Brittany didn't just quit. She studied everything, how the company operated, where its weaknesses were, which investors were unhappy, which departments were struggling under Lucas's leadership. She built contacts outside of Titan Strategies, meeting with industry leaders and forming relationships with investors. Then, when the moment was right, she walked into Gregory Walters' office and handed in her resignation. "You sure about this?" the CEO asked, studying her. She nodded. "I have something else in mind." He didn't press. And just like that, she walked away. No severance package. No fanfare. Just a simple resignation letter and a quiet exit from the company she had once dreamed of helping build. Lucas didn't even try to stop her. He smirked when she told him, acting as if it was nothing more than a temporary setback. "You'll land on your feet," he said, in that patronizing tone that made her want to throw her coffee in his face. "I'm sure you'll find something that suits you." She smiled. "I already have." Brittany moved into a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. A far cry from the sleek penthouse she had shared with Lucas, but she didn't care. She had never really belonged in that world, the one where Lucas measured success by the brand of his watch and the exclusivity of his golf club membership. She took on contract work, consulting for small businesses, worked long hours, studied the market, and quietly built the foundation of what would become her next venture. And then she met Theo Hudson. Theo had been an executive at a Fortune 500 company before he walked away from the corporate world, tired of the toxicity and bureaucracy. He was brilliant, respected, and, most importantly, interested in hearing what Brittany had to say. "I read your proposal from Titan Strategies," he told her over coffee one morning, sliding the folder across the table. The one they never implemented. Brittany hesitated before opening it. She hadn't expected to see her work again. "You did your research," she said. Theo smiled. "I do my research on people." That was the beginning. Together, they built Skyline Global, a consulting firm focused on the very strategies Titan Strategies had ignored. Brittany poured every ounce of her energy into it. She lived off savings, worked 16-hour days, and built her client base from the ground up. Within a year, they had landed their first major contract. Within 2 years, Skyline Global was making waves in the industry. And within 3 years, they had become a direct competitor to Titan Strategies. Brittany didn't just succeed. She thrived. Skyline Global wasn't just another consulting firm, it was a disruptive force in the industry. Companies that had once turned to Titan Strategies were now calling her. Investors who had been frustrated with Titan's stagnation were eager to hear her ideas. She had done what Lucas never believed she could do. She had built something on her own. And then, one morning, Brittany's assistant placed a report on her desk. She glanced at the first page and smiled. Titan Strategies was in trouble. The company's stock had plummeted. Key investors were pulling out. Employees were resigning in waves. And Lucas? He was drowning. Brittany leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers against the desk as she studied the numbers. Then, she turned to her assistant. "Schedule a meeting," she said. "Meeting with who?" She smiled. "Titan Strategies." Brittany arrived at the Sterling Hotel, the same place where Lucas had humiliated her 5 years ago. The grand chandeliers still glowed with soft golden light, the marble floors gleamed, and executives milled around in their expensive suits, discussing numbers and deals over overpriced cocktails. But this time, Brittany wasn't just another guest. She was here as a power player. Titan Strategies had requested the meeting. Lucas's company was sinking. Investors were fleeing. Clients were pulling contracts. The once dominant consulting giant was now gasping for air. And they needed a lifeline. Brittany stepped out of the black town car, the driver holding the door open for her. She adjusted the sleek navy suit she had chosen for tonight, sharp, commanding, powerful. The front doors of the Sterling Hotel opened automatically as she strode inside. She felt eyes on her. Some recognized her. Others whispered her name. The woman who had once been dismissed as just Lucas Banks' wife was now the CEO of the company poised to either save or destroy Titan Strategies. A hotel staff member led her to a private conference room on the 12th floor. Inside, they were waiting. Lucas sat at the head of the table, his once effortless confidence dimmed but not gone. His dark suit was impeccable, his hair styled, but there was something different in his face, an edge of desperation he was trying to hide. Beside him sat Titan's remaining board members, men and women who had once laughed along with him when he humiliated her. Now, their faces were tight, their expressions carefully composed. They had no choice but to invite her here. And they all knew it. Brittany walked to the empty seat at the other end of the long conference table. She didn't sit. Instead, she took her time, setting down the leather folder she had brought, her movements deliberate. Then she looked up, meeting Lucas's gaze. He was watching her closely, searching for any sign of emotion. Regret. Nostalgia. Anger. She gave him nothing. "Miss Clark," one of the board members began, clearing his throat, "thank you for taking the time to meet with us." She didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch, forcing them to sit in their own discomfort. Then, finally, she spoke. "I was curious," she said, her voice smooth. "Titan Strategies never took my ideas seriously before. What's changed?" A flicker of irritation passed across Lucas's face. One of the other board members, an older man named Richard Caldwell, leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "We're prepared to discuss a strategic partnership between Titan Strategies and Skyline Global." "A partnership," Brittany echoed, tilting her head. "Yes," Caldwell continued. "We believe a collaboration could be mutually beneficial. We recognize Skyline Global's success, and we believe Titan's expertise can still bring value to the table." Brittany smiled, slow and calculated. "You want my help?" Lucas shifted in his seat, exhaling sharply. "That's not how I'd phrase it." She turned her gaze to him. "Then how would you phrase it, Lucas?" His jaw tightened. Brittany leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "I read your financials," she continued, keeping her tone light. "Your stock is down 43% in the past 6 months. You've lost 3 of your top 5 clients. And your internal surveys show a 60% drop in employee satisfaction. That's not a company looking for a partnership." She let that sit for a moment. "That's a company looking for a savior." The silence was deafening. Lucas's fingers curled around the pen in front of him. "This isn't." "I wasn't finished," Brittany interrupted smoothly. Lucas's mouth snapped shut. Brittany turned her attention back to the board. I don't do partnerships with companies that dismissed me, sabotaged me, and mocked me, she said, letting her eyes linger on each of them. Titan Strategies needs Skyline Global. But Skyline Global? We don't need you. A murmur spread through the room. Lucas's knuckles were white. Caldwell cleared his throat again. Then, are you saying you're not interested in a deal at all? Oh, I'm interested. She smiled. But not in a partnership. She slowly opened the leather folder she had placed on the table and slid a document forward. A formal acquisition offer. Silence. Lucas's face drained of color. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This isn't a negotiation, Brittany said simply. It's a takeover. The silence in the conference room stretched for so long that Brittany could almost hear the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the room. An acquisition. Not a merger. Not a partnership. A complete takeover. Lucas was the first to react. He let out a sharp breath, his jaw tightening as he leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the polished mahogany table. The easy charm that had always been his P*N of choice was gone. In its place was something colder, something closer to panic. You can't be serious, he scoffed, but there was no confidence behind the words. Oh, I'm very serious, Brittany said, her voice smooth. She leaned forward, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against the acquisition document. This is a fair offer, she continued, given the state of your company. I'm offering above market value for your remaining assets, but let's be honest, there's no other option. You don't have enough liquidity to sustain another quarter. Your clients are fleeing. Your stockholders are restless. If you don't accept, you won't have anything left to negotiate within a few months. Lucas's face was unreadable, but Brittany knew him too well. He was scrambling. Trying to find a way out. Trying to regain control. Caldwell, the board member who had spoken earlier, rubbed his temple. We need to discuss this. Brittany shrugged. Of course. Take your time. She glanced at her watch. You have 48 hours. Lucas's head snapped up. Are you kidding? Not at all. Brittany gathered her papers, standing with a grace that came naturally to her now. I don't need this deal. You do. She turned to leave, but just before she reached the door, she stopped. Then, without turning around, she said, and Lucas. She let the pause hang, savoring the moment. You won't be CEO when this deal goes through. She walked out without waiting for his reaction. Over the next 2 days, Lucas fought. Not just against the board. Against reality. He tried rallying investors, but most of them refused to take his calls. The ones who did? They weren't interested in empty promises anymore. They wanted results. They wanted stability. And Lucas, whose charm had once been enough to secure funding, clients, and trust, could no longer provide that. He tried reaching out to old allies. Former executives, colleagues, people he had mentored over the years. None of them backed him. Titan Strategies was a sinking ship, and no one wanted to drown with it. Even the board, once filled with his supporters, had turned against him. We have no choice, Caldwell told him during an emergency meeting. Skyline Global's offer is the only thing standing between us and total collapse. Lucas clenched his fists beneath the table. He had spent years building this company. It was supposed to be his legacy. And now? Now, his ex-wife was about to take it all away from him. The worst part? He couldn't even argue. Because Brittany had been right. Titan Strategies didn't need a partnership. They needed a savior. And the only person willing to save them was the same woman he had humiliated 5 years ago. Irony was a cruel mistress. The official signing took place at Skyline Global's headquarters, a sleek, modern office that was everything Titan Strategies used to be before it started crumbling. Lucas sat across from Brittany, the acquisition contract laid out between them. He had barely spoken since he walked into the room. Brittany, on the other hand, was completely at ease. She flipped through the pages, then slid a pen across the table to him. Whenever you're ready, she said lightly. Lucas didn't reach for the pen. Instead, he studied her. She had changed. She wasn't the woman he had once dismissed. The woman whose ideas he had ignored. The woman he had thought would always be in his shadow. No, she was better now. Stronger. More powerful than he had ever been. And for the first time, he realized something that made his stomach twist. He had never actually been the strongest one in their marriage. She had just been waiting to show him. Lucas exhaled sharply. This was personal for you, wasn't it? Brittany smiled, tilting her head slightly. Of course it was. He let out a humorless laugh, shaking his head. You always were smarter than I gave you credit for. She didn't deny it. Didn't give him the satisfaction of false humility. Instead, she simply said, you should have listened to me when you had the chance. Lucas stared at the contract in front of him. Signing it meant the end of everything he had built. But not signing? That meant total bankruptcy. It meant losing completely. At least this way, he got something out of it. So, finally, after a long moment of hesitation, Lucas picked up the pen and scrawled his name across the dotted line. And just like that, Titan Strategies was no longer his. It was hers. Brittany officially took over as CEO the next day. One of her first actions? A complete restructuring of the company. She fired half the senior executives, the same ones who had laughed at her that night at the gala. She implemented a new corporate culture, one that valued innovation over politics. She made it clear that Titan Strategies wasn't just surviving under her leadership. It was thriving. And Lucas? He was given a consultant position. A meaningless title with no real power. The once golden boy of Titan Strategies now had an office 3 floors down from his old one, a much smaller, less impressive space. Employees whispered about his downfall in hushed tones. The man who had once ruled the company now had to report to the woman he had once mocked. And every day, he had to watch as Brittany did what he never could. She saved the company. She made it stronger. She turned it into something greater than he ever imagined. And there was nothing he could do about it. Brittany watched Lucas struggle to adjust. Watched as he realized that his name no longer carried the weight it once did. Watched as the respect he had once commanded slowly disappeared. Did she feel sorry for him? No, not even a little. This was the consequence of underestimating her. And she had no sympathy for men who thought women were better off in their shadows. Lucas had spent years thinking he was untouchable. Now? He was nothing. And Brittany? She was everything he had once feared. A woman with power. A woman in control. A woman who didn't just win. She conquered. Lucas sat in his new office, a cramped, windowless space 3 floors below the executive suites. The walls were bare, the furniture functional but uninspiring. The prestigious corner office he had once occupied was now Brittany's, and she had wasted no time making it her own. A sleek mahogany desk, floor-to-ceiling windows, modern art on the walls, it was a stark contrast to his dull, uninspired surroundings. She didn't even have to say anything. The demotion was enough of a message. Lucas had once been the king of Titan Strategies. Now, he was nothing more than a consultant in name only, a figurehead with no real influence, no power, no voice. Brittany hadn't fired him outright. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, she had done something worse. She had made him stay. Every morning, he had to walk into the same building where he had once ruled, past employees who used to greet him with respect but now whispered behind his back. The worst part? He had no one to blame but himself. Lucas had spent years believing he was untouchable, that he could control everything, that his charm and influence would always keep him on top. But Brittany had proven him wrong. He saw it in the way employees now looked past him, their focus entirely on her. In meetings, it was Brittany they deferred to. When big decisions were made, she was the one people sought out. Lucas found himself sidelined, his once powerful voice reduced to background noise. Even the board members who had once been his allies no longer cared what he had to say. Caldwell, who had been one of Lucas's biggest supporters, barely acknowledged him now. Miss Clark is handling things well, he had told Lucas during a brief encounter in the hallway. Titan's finally stabilizing under her leadership. Lucas had clenched his fists at that. Her leadership. The company he had once built, the empire he had envisioned, now hers. And the worst part? She was doing a better job than he ever had. Profits were climbing. Investors were returning. Employees were thriving under her management, no longer suffocated by the toxic culture Lucas had fostered. Brittany had taken everything he thought made him great and done it better. And she knew it. Brittany made a point of keeping their interactions professional. She never gloated, never rubbed it in his face. But her silence? That was worse. One afternoon, Lucas received an email marked urgent. A company-wide meeting. Mandatory attendance. He walked into the boardroom, one he used to command, and found a seat at the far end of the table. A position that had once belonged to junior executives, not him. Brittany stood at the head of the room, poised and confident. She addressed the team with ease, discussing Titan's future, new expansion plans, and upcoming acquisitions. She was in complete control, and everyone in the room knew it. Then she glanced at him. Not with anger. Not with mockery. Just a quiet, cold indifference. Like he didn't matter. And in that moment, Lucas realized something horrifying. He really didn't. His presence in this room wasn't necessary. Titan Strategies was moving forward, and he was nothing but a relic of the past. Brittany's voice cut through his thoughts. Before we wrap up, I have one final announcement. She clicked a button on the remote in her hand, and the screen behind her shifted. A new organizational structure. Lucas scanned the names. His title was still there. Senior Business Consultant. But next to it? Reporting to CEO Brittany Clark. Not the board. Not senior executives. Her. He felt his face heat as the implication sank in. She had made it official. His job, the position he had once used to undermine her, was now directly beneath hers. There was no escaping it. Every single thing he did in this company would require her approval. It was a public declaration of who held the power now. He clenched his fists under the table, swallowing the humiliation burning in his throat. Brittany clicked the remote again. That's all for today. Thank you. Chairs scraped against the floor as people gathered their things. Conversations resumed. Employees left in small groups, some still chatting about the new initiatives. Lucas sat frozen. He had been officially stripped of any real influence. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Later that evening, as Brittany walked through the executive hallways, she spotted Lucas in his tiny office. The same man who had once ruled this building now sat hunched over his desk, staring blankly at a meaningless report. She paused. For a brief second, she wondered if she should say something, offer some small shred of sympathy. But then she remembered the way he had humiliated her. The way he had mocked her ambitions, dismissed her intelligence, tried to erase her presence in the corporate world. She had owed him nothing then. And she owed him even less now. So she simply turned and walked away, leaving Lucas alone with the one thing he had never been able to handle. His own failure. 1 year after the acquisition, Titan Strategies was unrecognizable. Under Brittany's leadership, the company had transformed. Toxic executives had been removed, new strategies were implemented, and profits had surged beyond anything the board had anticipated. Investors who had once fled were now eager to return. Brittany had done more than just take over. She had rebuilt Titan from the ground up, turning it into a powerhouse even stronger than before. And Lucas? He was gone. It happened quietly. A resignation letter left on Brittany's desk. No dramatic exit, no bitter outburst. Just a single sheet of paper confirming what everyone already knew. Lucas Banks could no longer survive in a company where he wasn't at the top. He had tried, for months, to find a way back to relevance. But every time he walked into a meeting, no one cared what he had to say. Every time a major decision was made, he wasn't involved. Every day, he had to report to her, the woman he once thought wasn't capable of running a business. The woman he had sabotaged, humiliated, and dismissed. And every day, he realized how wrong he had been. His pride could only take so much. So, he left. No farewell party. No one rushing to stop him. Just a handful of quiet goodbyes and a final, reluctant handshake with Caldwell. Brittany wasn't there when he walked out of Titan Strategies for the last time. She didn't need to be. His departure wasn't a victory for her. It was just inevitable. On the anniversary of the takeover, Brittany stood in her office, the same office Lucas had once occupied. She glanced out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city skyline stretching endlessly before her. This was her empire now. Lucas was just a footnote in the company's history. There was no trace of his leadership left. No reminders of his reign. Titan Strategies had become something better than he ever could have made it.